and can also be a good bureaucrat. With that, Eileen, would you conclude the panelist statements?
I will, and is this on? First of all, I want to thank the organizers for including me in this session.
I forgot to introduce you. I apologize. I forgot to introduce Eileen because I thought everyone knows her. She doesn't need any introduction, but maybe to be fair, Eileen Kennedy is Dean, Gerald and Dorothy Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, friends.
Apologize.
Again, I want to thank IFPRI for including me. The overall, I think, have been superb sessions. I was asked by the organizers not to deviate very much from my prepared comments, but I'm not sure I'm going to behave because I've been taking copious notes. But anyway, this has been a wonderful opportunity. I've run into people I haven't seen in a number of years, and it's a bit like deja vu because as you think about agriculture and nutrition, it's not a new concept, and some of the work that began at IFPRI and other places in the early 1980s were exactly this. We had a strong presence almost 20 years ago now at the International Conference on Nutrition sponsored by WHO and FAO. And somebody I ran into a little bit ago here, Joachim von Braun, I remember one of the comments he used to make when we began talking about ag and health was that ag nutrition, ag health, it's like a marriage. And I chuckle because I think if it was a marriage, it's been a pretty rocky marriage. But now we've had some marriage counseling, so maybe it's gotten a little bit better. But the reality is we don't have a lot of success stories in where whatever your goal is nutritionally, and by better linking ag and health or ag and nutrition, you've had significant impacts. Now let me anchor it back to what I was asked to discuss, which is what have we learned from what is listed here as high-income countries. We know there's now a global face of nutrition. Side by side, there are the classic problems of undernutrition with overnutrition, chronic diseases. And regrettably, the ink was not even dry on the Millennium Development Goals when we knew we were having a real problem in chronic diseases, diet-related chronic diseases in developing countries. I understand why the MDGs didn't deal with this. They wanted to focus on undernutrition. But back in when Gro Brundtland was still Director General of WHO, there's a clear focus on in the poorest countries in the world. We knew we were seeing problems of chronic diseases, obviously overweight and obesity and a lagged effect on diabetes and other chronic diseases. So it's a bit of a missed opportunity. Where do I think we need to go forward? I think given the double burden of disease, there are some challenges. It's not the same as what we've learned in dealing with undernutrition. In part, we have a huge urban problem. And Linda, your point, well taken, where we at Tufts are working in partnership with a number of developing countries, in China, specifically in Shanghai, in some urban areas of sub-Saharan Africa, where we're seeing increases in chronic diseases. So the urban approaches are not very well developed. And I'll throw a question out to the group. I have yet to see a countrywide approach, a national approach to preventing overweight and obesity that's been successful. I'd love to be proven wrong. And I tend to, when I deal a bit with policy officials, because there's a tendency to look at, let me use the example of what's the equivalent of vitamin A supplementation, but as a treatment to prevention of obesity, and I don't believe it exists. I think what we're looking at, and this is where ag nutrition comes in, is a multi-sectoral approach for chronic diseases. And I tend to refer to it as a large puzzle with 1,000 pieces. Some of the pieces larger than others, but unless you have all the pieces, the puzzle is not complete. Several people have talked about a policy focus, and I had the honor of co-chairing in the United States the National Nutrition Summit in 2000 with the then Surgeon General David Satcher, and we were unequivocal that the foundation of good health and good nutrition is food security. And I get a little bit concerned about some fuzzy thinking in the public health community where you start getting policy suggestions, not you, Patrick, policy suggestions that maybe we should make food more expensive and people would eat less. Well, so you get where I'm going on that one. But it occurred to me that we've been talking about policies, but not really very much about consumers. And let me take the U.S. because back in 2007 with Richard Deckelbaum, I published a book called The Nation's Nutrition. What did we learn post-World War II up until around the year 2000? And what did people want? People in the United States, adults, what did adults want in the United States post-World War II, vis-a-vis the topics we're talking about? They wanted higher income, they wanted more variety in the diet, and they wanted more leisure time. And we've summarized a lot of quantification on that. A lot of people in the United States and OECD countries have gotten what they've asked for. And so as we begin thinking about, well, what are the implications for healthy lifestyles, diet, and physical activity, unless you think about taste as the basic motivator and think about how do we get people to demand tasty foods that they can afford and that are accessible, I think we'll continue to be unsuccessful in some of the new challenges. Having worked in U.S. government as a policy official, I find policies a very imprecise way of changing behaviors. I think you need an enabling policy environment, but I think we have to collectively do more than that. The challenges are daunting, and I do get concerned when people throw out suggestions. A lot of spirit of full disclosure. I am at the moment working in both Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa on agriculture nutrition linkages as a way of improving nutritional status both over and under. And lo and behold, let me give one example, this is my last, the issue of, well, let's engage in nutrition education. And I can tell you based on evidence, we will continue to be ineffective on what is broadly called nutrition education if we use the traditional paradigms. Because messages like eat well, reduce your fat are meaningless to consumers because that's not what consumers do. Eat less fat, you may take the skin off chicken, bring an apple to work. Those are specific behaviors. And I think there's a body of delivery science that's needed in addition to policy. But we have to invest in this. And I said it was my last. Well, let me just say on healthcare cost, I think the U.S. as a nation has done abysmally in investing in preventive health care. We're probably second to none in our technology around medical care. But if we had taken even half the time to think about a public health preventive measure, I think some of the problems we have, we wouldn't. And let me just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have a number of very important issues here on the table. We would like to use the remaining time for discussions with the audience, and panelists will respond to whatever question they feel is addressing them. So, yes?
I'm David Beckman from Bread for the World in the U.S. I'm struck here. I'm struck by. It doesn't work. I don't think. I don't think I need it. I'm struck by.
They want to record it for you too, though.
I'm struck by how much, at least the U.S. has to learn from Brazil or even Rwanda about reducing hunger, malnutrition, and poverty. So, if you just look at the trajectory in Brazil, the progress that they have made, and the creative solutions that they've come up with, and most importantly, the national commitment that they've been able to mobilize to reduce hunger and poverty, it seems to me, and the specific solutions, even like the Bolsa Familiar. So I just wonder, is anybody organizing a process by which the OECD countries can learn from the rapid progress that many developing countries have made against poverty? Because I think they're doing some things right. And certainly my own country, but I think all the OECD, none of the OECD countries have experienced the kind of rapid progress that many of the developing countries have achieved. And I think we could learn from that, but I don't know who's organizing that process. So is Tufts going to organize that?
Let's take a couple of let's take a couple of questions more. If there's none, maybe one of
Well,
panelists would like to answer that.
kind of, having worked both in government and some of my research, David, on nutrition assistance program, I think we have a, I have to use the word schizophrenia, and I think sometimes this transcends political ideology. I think and it's never articulated this way, or I haven't heard it, but there are the needy poor and the undeserving poor. And depending on which program you're participating in, in the early stages started out trying to look at how to have greater impact to the food stamp program and then also WIC. And if you look at the public perception, and then this relates to budget allocations, the public perception of food stamp recipients is actually often quite negative. These are low-income, income-constrained people at very austere levels. Whereas the WIC program, I'm delighted, has gone through exponential growth since it was a pilot project in the early 1990s. And if you hear people who have, I'm not talking about bad bureaucrats, but if you hear communities talking about it, often it's, well, WIC is for pregnant women and children. They deserve good nutrition. And it's so frustrating to not hear the same about a food stamp kind of program. And again, I was dismayed this past season when we were trying to pass reauthorization of child nutrition. I'm delighted we did. So it's school lunch, school breakfast, WIC, some other programs. But part of the financing of that increase in allocation to child nutrition programs is going to come out of food stamps. And again, I think woolly thinking, fuzzy thinking, the assumption is if we have better meals in schools and for children, we'll have a quantum impact on overweight and obesity in children. But you're taking money away from households to give to children, and someone has to look very seriously at evidence-based, what is the net impact on that? I think the faith-based community has an enormous role to play because you're seen as broad-based and not ideological.
To sort of build on Eileen's comments, I think that's really good. And one of the ways in unraveling policy a little bit, and specifically looking at the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program in the U.S., is if you look at first who, say, farm subsidies benefit. In the United States, only around 1% of the population farms. They're the ones who receive subsidies in addition to the large agribusinesses that are engaged in the practices. And the majority, about 90% of those subsidies, go to 5 crops in the U.S. So if you look at who really benefits from policies, I think that policies should really be driven from the bottom. Now, in India or in a lot of developing countries, the people that we would really be looking at would be the smallholder farmers. In the U.S., I think that it's pretty easy to actually look at consumers who are disadvantaged based on these farm policies. About 40 million Americans are on supplemental nutrition assistance, food stamps, colloquially known. And when you look at the burden of dietary disease, it doesn't fall evenly in the U.S. If you're poor, minority, disenfranchised, far more likely to suffer dietary disease. And I'm, like Brad, I'm not one to sort of advocate a lot of answers here, rather raise questions, spark debate. But perhaps one answer, and maybe this will generate a few more questions, Perhaps an answer might be to require a percentage of food stamp of that benefit going to the recipient to be used to purchase healthy foods. However, some bureaucrat chooses to define that, because in a lot of urban centers where the poor and the minorities live, you might have food deserts and just not have access to healthy foods. And that could be a way to shore up demand from the consumer level.
I didn't know, none of us have met before, so Patrick, I don't think that's going to work. And the reason I stand corrected on food stamps, it's no longer food stamps, it's SNAP. They changed the name. I just don't think that approach will work, because if you look at the way the program is now structured, for the average family, the amount is inframarginal, so they're spending less on food via food stamps than they would ordinarily spend. So you may constrain, and again, this is a research issue, your food stamp SNAP purchases to, quote, healthy foods. I test you to find those, but then you'd still have the increased money that they're spending that to be used however. So I feel that's a very punitive way to deal with a healthful diet, and I think the positive rather than the negative. But again, that's a researchable issue.
Seems to,
It worked.
It worked? Right? No, but let me just say, since I'm from Europe, we do have a lot of income support programs, in contrast to the United States. They're very, shall we say, generous income support programs. If you're under a certain age, you have a salary for at least 2 or 3 years. So there's a lot of support for people that are poor, rather than perhaps direct food stamp kind. But we also have feeding programs and school programs for poor children, etc. So it's a slightly different social setting, because we have good public health care in addition, and that's why the rise in obesity and overweight has become an issue, because it's the public sector which has to pay the costs of that incidence, as compared to in the United States when it's a private sector kind of problem to some extent. You have to bear with your own problem. Which is not the case in Europe. And I would like to to agree with Eileen, is that the real problem is people's food choices. And we're not able to understand, there's a whole set of literature and psychology now out there about why people, they can't stop eating. They can't eat one cookie, they have to eat 10 cookies. And so we say, well, let's make the package smaller. Well, then they eat 2 packages, because the environment, our food environment, is such that it's very difficult to break away from that. And everywhere you go, on every corner, there's something tempting. And given that the relative prices of these inputs, which is fat and sugar and white flour, it's not that expensive to do that. So people can buy the apple, the orange, but they choose to buy something else for the same amount of money, or it's the sugary drink syndrome that have been now outlawed in a lot of in most French schools. They cannot sell them there, and in Italian schools, we've abandoned that there. So, you just can't sell that. And the food system now supplies organics to many schools. So there's a lot of local initiatives that can be done, or that to modify to some extent, that maybe people will, once they break the habit. But it's like breaking a habit. And in theoretical economics, one of the ways we say that sometimes the addiction is so strong that the only way you can break the habit is to get rid of the environment, which means you have to get rid of the product.